All right, we are live with Miss Bette Phillips-Campbell, the founder of the Victorian Truck Drivers Memorial. Hello, Betty.
Hi, Stephen. How you going?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good.
And how is the COVID-19 crisis hurting you?
Well, I'm actually lucky because I can do my work from home.
Mm-hmm.
It's not ideal, but I am able to work from home because my core work is home visits in supporting families after a work-related fatality of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a occasion yesterday to speak with a brand new client whose husband only died on Monday, and while it would be much nicer to be able to sit across the table and talk with her over a cup of tea, we were able to do it by phone. So it's not ideal, but at least we're still able to keep the support going.
Yeah. How many names are on the Victorian Truck Drivers Memorial now?
About 150. And this year we have another 12 ready to go on.
Okay.
So we don't have the high numbers like the National Memorial, of course, because but for Victorians, this year we've got 12.
Okay. And that's been postponed from June until a date to be fixed? Or have you fixed a date?
Yeah, we will have it later in the year, we're pretty sure, but we just need to be mindful of other dates, for particularly the National Memorial on the 31st of October and the South Australia Memorial at White Hills, which will be the following week, and I can't remember the date for that, but it's usually the week after Takata, and so we will fit in there somewhere, we hope.
Okay. And so you work, where do you work?
Okay, I actually work out of the city, so Grief Work is the agency I manage, and it's a state program across Victoria, obviously, and so we're based in the city. In Brand, work for Uniting, which is formerly Uniting Care, but it's a non-secular service, and so I'm based in the city, but I could be a truckie, Stephen. I do about 800 kilometres a week doing home visits, so it's a program.
Sorry?
It's a big program.
Yeah. Well, you've been nominated for an award, the Australian Trucking Association Transport Woman of the Year. Is that correct?
It is.
Congratulations.
Totally gobsmacked. Thank you. Totally gobsmacked and totally out of left field. And when they rang me to tell me, I was actually surprised. I was emotional because I don't work for awards. I just love what I do, and there's great satisfaction in what I do. When you see our clients growing through their grief, and be named even in an award is for me very humbling.
Yeah, it is just to be nominated. Congratulations.
Just nominated,
a lot of great work. I mean, every time I've been to the National Road Transport Hall of Fame in Alice Springs, you've been there volunteering.
I only did once. I only did 1 week. It's not easy for me to take time off work, and but the week I was there and you were there, and it was, I think, maybe, Stephen, that's the first time that you and I met.
In person, I think so, yeah.
And, I just loved it. I think, it's such an amazing tribute to the industry. And it was really good for me. Although my dad was a truckie and my two brothers were truckies, it was just an amazing experience to be part of something so big.
Yeah, it's such a good time up there.
Yeah.
Now, you have a suicide walk.
We do. Suicide Prevention Awareness Network, shortened to SPAN. 10 years ago, I instigated a walk in Bendigo, following from one that we began in Geelong. And so I had eight widows and a mum who'd lost loved ones to suicide through work. And so we started the walk, and we get about 500 walkers. We have about 200 Ride for Life motorcyclists. And this year, if we'd have had it in March, we would have had 100 cyclists who I think they're called Cycle for Wellbeing. And we've postponed that till Mental Health Week. But what we've discovered last year was that 4 families that I've been working through in the transport industry had lost a loved one to suicide, and they took part in that walk. And it's certainly an indicator for me that the suicides in the industry are probably vastly underreported.
I think so.
You know,
because how do they count them when they drive their ute home, go into the garage, close the garage door, and gas themselves in their ute? Because that's the last 2 of my friends that have committed suicide. That's how they've done it.
Okay.
In the ute after work.
Yeah. We don't use the word committed suicide these days.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah. What's the term?
Okay, it's just people who suicided or died by suicide. In the old days, suicide used to be illegal. Yeah. And so if a member of your family took their life, the family lost everything.
Oh, okay.
And so back in I think even as early as in the 1900s, and so it was a crime. Okay. And it's not, in my mind, it's a crime that things get to, people are allowed to get to that state.
Yeah, for sure.
But crime in a different term. But so now they use the term suicide.
Dude. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And no, I'm not pathetic, I am. Yeah. But the other thing is Suicide Prevention Australia encourage people, if they're talking about suicide on a public level, that they don't talk about the method, because it may be somebody listening. It may trigger trauma for them because they've lost a loved one in the same way. So we just talk about people who took their life, and then we talk about the fact that I don't know about other states, but I suspect from what I understand it's the same. I've got people on waiting lists that I would like to see psychologists for further support. Here in Victoria, it's up to 8 months waiting list to see a psychologist. We've had clients that I've needed to put into care for Suicide Watch, and they are there, they're assessed, and most often they're sent home because there are no beds and there are no places. The places are just totally booked out. And so if you're looking at one of the reasons why suicide is so high, that there's just not the support there. The mental health system can't cope. And my worry now with the virus, and we know people are losing their jobs and losing their businesses. Where we sit through grief work, we're concerned about the spike in suicides. And just recently I was in Corryong, and I spoke to 200 farmers who lost property in the recent fires. So those farmers have gone through drought and now fires, and they're certainly worried about suicides after the fires. And bringing it back to the trucking industry, Stephen, the pressure that truck drivers are under trying to get stuff to supermarkets, and I think if the number of truck deaths in any other industry, if the number of truck deaths were happening in another industry, there would be a royal commission about why.
Oh, of course. I've said it many times on the record. So that's, I mean, there was one particular story that I got told. A guy had just had enough, pulled up at that parking bay north of Parks there and just put himself in the tree there.
Yeah.
And other drivers have to come across that.
That's right. That's right.
And it shouldn't be part of our work to become used to seeing corpses.
No, I agree.
Mm.
But I just think that there needs to be less stress across. One of my hopes about this virus thing is that we'll start to value other things than material things. Family, friends. I just hope that out of this virus there is some change that comes around how we relate to each other and how we care about each other. I just think it's really we need change. And I have spoken to, there are a couple of ladies who refer drivers to me, and I think you might have at one stage, Stevens, referred a driver to talk to me.
Yep.
But about where they've had somebody suicide by truck. And
it's been quite common lately with the lady up here in Queensland with the 5 kids or 4 kids in the car.
Oh, yes, I remember that one.
I know that driver will never drive a truck again.
Yeah.
His workmates have talked to me, and his life's destroyed.
And I had a man ring me down here in Victoria who'd had a lady suicide by truck, and his truck was a write-off, and he had a 3 months wait to get another truck, and so his income was compromised, and so not only did he have the trauma of what happened, but he had the trauma of the fact that his work was compromised because his vehicle was not available to him.
There's a lot of things that just keep compounding these issues for drivers and their families.
Yeah, exactly. Not to mention those who drop rocks off bridges onto trucks. I mean, I've talked to drivers where they've had that occur, and I've had it from people in cars on the Monash Freeway with kids dropping water bombs on cars as they go under the overhead bridges.
Yep.
And it's frightening. Yeah. It's terrifying.
Yep.
And I don't know what's wrong with our world, Stephen, really.
Well, people are slowly changing the standards and conditions. Now, you had a lot to do with changing the legislation in Victoria, the state legislation to recognise truck driver deaths.
Correct.
How did that come about? And what is it now? How is the reporting?
Much better. Mind you, since this has happened, we've only had 2 truck fatalities, I think, since it. And the law actually doesn't come in until July. Okay. I've banged on about it. I've been doing this job now for 22 years, so that makes me a dinosaur. We had our first truck-related death referred to us in 2006, and it grew from there. And so and WorkSafe provide sponsorship or grants to provide the service, and so I have always been banging on at them about the fact that truck drivers are in their mobile workplaces, and so when a truck driver dies doing his work, it's a work death. So about a year ago, I was invited to be part of the family reference group on work-related manslaughter, and so I said that in those meetings I was very strong about, if we're talking about industrial manslaughter, we have to include trucks, because trucks are often unroadworthy, brakes are unroadworthy. We've got one case at the moment that's been going for about 6 years, where a truck driver, his tanker came off, and he killed a lady and her small son and an older lady.
Mm-hmm.
And in two separate cars.
Mm-hmm.
And that's still going through the courts. In fact, it was due to go through court in April, but with the virus, courts are all being held in abeyance, so we're waiting for that to happen. But so then I pushed that through the family reference group, and so WorkSafe have now, in fact, I had lunch with a senior person from WorkSafe, who said that I had achieved that long held goal of having truck deaths included in the work deaths. So it's taken a long time, and I really hope other states will follow.
Oh, I hope so too. I'm going to be bringing that up at the Senate inquiry when or if they ever get out of lockdown and we have a hearing. Is the Victorian Truck Drivers Memorial going to supply a submission to the Senate, and are you going to talk to the senators?
We took part in the Senate inquiry into the aftermath of work-related deaths, and so that submission would go through to the new Senate inquiry, I'm sure, from what I understand. One of the sad things from the Senate inquiry was that the senators on that inquiry have made a very strong indication that grief work is the only service in Australia that provides support in the way that we do, and particularly towards work-related death. So we would want to see a model such as grief work in other states. I take phone calls from families in other states as it is. In fact, just last week I spoke to a man whose son died in a crane accident 2 years ago, and there's some research being done by Safe Work Australia at the moment, and I was the first person interviewed for that, and so they are actually referring people to me from other states, and this poor man had been searching for 2 years for support. He went to a psychologist, and she basically said to him, oh, well, your son was young and you can expect young people to die. And if I'd have been that man, I'd have reached across and grabbed that lady by the throat, to be honest. But he had no satisfaction. And one psychologist that he went to see, she specialised in sexual abuse, and so she had no ability to understand his grief at losing his son. So there needs to be a shake-up in the industry and recognise that the aftermath of a work death is quite different. And in the transport industry, I've had widows say to me, because, as you know, truck drivers are on the road a lot, and one lady said to me, her friend said, well, I don't know why you miss him. He was never there. And what about the phone calls? I know women that talk to their husbands 2 or 3 times a day, and I know one dad who parks up at night and reads a story over the phone to his 2-year-old. The value, we don't have to be face-to-face to have relationship.
Yep. It's heartbreaking.
It is. It's so wrong. And, and my worry for young boys who lose their dads in the industry in particular, every boy wants to grow up and drive a truck like Dad, and when Dad dies in a crash, they lose that contact with the driver, with their dad, and with the industry. And I wish that we could find some way of helping particularly teenage boys still have a connection to the industry, so that, they lose dad, they lose a whole lot of things when dad dies in the transport, or any work for that matter, but particularly in the trucking industry. I know my two brothers, dad drove a truck, so my two brothers drove trucks.
What about like there's more and more women driving trucks.
Yep.
And there's currently initiatives to get more women into driving trucks. And I mean, if we were killing that many women a week or in driving trucks, I think they'd do something. But I think that because it's a male-dominated industry, that it has a different mindset or parameter where it's accepted that truck drivers die, but if you put women in those trucks and you kill women, like we'll only need to, like when I announce we've had the 100th lady to get killed driving trucks, like maybe that'll make a difference.
Yeah, people would be gobsmacked. I think work across the board, if you look at work across the board, I have probably a small smattering of parents who've lost a son in a work death, and my own experience was my only son died in a work accident 28 years ago. Mm-hmm. But across the board, deaths are predominantly male, so predominantly my clients are all widows. So if you look at that across the board, and I know that there's been a couple of women who have died. Gail Little, for example, at Port Augusta, near Port Augusta, and Gail's mum happens to live not too far from me, and so, but we're not seeing the women at this point die in connection. Sorry, in relationship to the number of men, but because
they're in such low representative numbers. Then their attrition rate isn't so high.
No.
But when you increase the percentages of women, you increase the percentages of that women are likely to be killed. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I actually live in regional Victoria. My home base is regional Victoria, and I'm 2 hours north of Melbourne. And I always stop at the Wallen Servo on my way through, usually for a coffee. And I happen to be listening, not intentionally, but listening to a lady truck driver on the phone. And I'm not sure who she was talking to, but clearly another driver. And I was listening to the things she was saying about how she was being treated. And what struck me was that when I talk to drivers, and I talk to a fair number of drivers these days, they are all saying the same kinds of things. And here was this woman driver saying the same kinds of things that I've heard from the men, about how they're treated, about the kind of pressure that they're under, and the fact that there was something wrong with the truck and the owner of the truck refused to listen to her. And I've heard male drivers say the same thing. In fact, I know one driver who he was driving for a company between Melbourne and Albury, and his brakes weren't working properly, and he kept reporting it. And anyhow, one day he just said, I'm not working for you anymore, and he quit the job because he and I had many conversations about your life is not worth your job.
Yeah.
I had another young woman who was based in Shepparton and was driving for a company in Shepparton, and the same thing, brakes. And she kept saying, my brakes are not working. And anyhow, she said to him, my life's not worth your job, and so she left. And
that's the only way you can change the standards is leave. We'll get someone else. That's it.
Yep.
That's how you increase standards. Is you leave that job.
That's exactly right.
And you get a better job.
And we did some research, as in grief work, did some research. My former director was and still is primarily a researcher, and we did some research about the other side of the coin, the companies that have fatalities and how that impacts on the workers. And Monash Uni, in fact, this Monday I was supposed to be at a conference talking about the impact of work deaths on fellow workers and companies. Obviously, it's been postponed. But we did some research which we're providing for them called I Think About Him Every Day. And, you know, the workers talked about how they were too frightened to complain about things that were wrong, because if they did, they'd lose their jobs. And, you know, many in particular, Stephen, and I shouldn't say that now because women work to put food on the table for their kids, but, you know, many in particular, they're frightened to lose their jobs because they've got a family to support.
That's true.
And I would expect that would be in the transport industry would be exactly the same.
It is.
You know, they're stuck in situations where there's very little escape.
Yeah, you're right. What are we going to do, Betty? What are we going to do?
We've got to keep banging on about it, Stephen, and we've got to keep rattling the cage and rattling the doors. You know, it took me, well, since 2006 when I got the first work-related death, and it's taken me up until now to get it recognised in WorkSafe Victoria. And I banged and banged and rattled and rattled and rattled until someone heard me. And you know, when I think about it, my dad died in 1982. Now, his best mate, and they'd been lifelong mates, Joe had stock rates, and so Dad used to drive log trucks and then he drove stock rates. And Dad developed cancer, mostly from smoking. And anyhow, in 1982, Dad's best mate died in a head-on collision just near Wodonga somewhere. And Joe died instantly, and it was from a driver the driver had actually gone to sleep, and the other drivers on the radio, remind me to come back to radios, the driver that's on the radios were trying to wake this driver up. Anyhow, he hit Joe head on. They held the road closed for 6 hours because it was the first time in 2 years that my dad hadn't been Joe's jockey, and they were looking for Dad. And Dad died exactly 3 months to the day after his mate died. And the doctor said to Mum at the time that Joe's death had accelerated Dad's cancer. And so going back to... So I interviewed Joe's wife around 2006 when we got our first... Because I wanted to know what it was like for her living in a small town when her husband died and she was left with small children. And you know, Stephen, the story that she told wasn't very different to the stories that I'm hearing today from current widows. But going back to the radios, we have a caravan, but we're very respectful of the truck drivers. But what we have the radio on so that, you know, and we're fortunate we have a camera on the back of our van, so we know what's going on in the back of our van when we're driving. But what I notice is there's very little chatter over the radios like there used to be, and there's not the mateship on the road. And I see that, you know, in the servos, you know, drivers sit on their own. They're eating their Maccas or their Kentucky. There's very little opportunity for decent food. And if they do have decent food, it's most often expensive. But they sit in isolation. And I just think in my dad's day, I used to go with Dad often in the truck when I was little, and we'd stop at a roadside servo and you knew where to stop because there were plenty of trucks out the front and you knew the food there was good. And all the drivers would be chatting and talking and they all knew each other, and there seemed to be this real comrade companionship.
It was mateship.
It was mateship. It was
a
good old Australian mateship, exactly.
It's definitely gone.
It's definitely gone, and you know,
it's I find remnants of it when injured drivers find the podcast and then contact me, and they say, "Oh, I've been looking for an outlet. I've had this idea. I want to take it somewhere, and I always thought, if we could just stick together, and I mean, we're all broken guys. All these guys that call me, either they're sick of seeing truck crashes on the road, they haven't been hurt themselves, or their mate got killed, or that they lost their leg, they lost their eye, that they were in a crash that was caused by someone else, and they pull one person out but can't get the other one, and they have to hear them burn to death and all that kind of thing, and then their lives ruined.
Well, when I worked before my son died, I worked for 15 years as a counsellor and public educator for spinal injury.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a number of truck drivers who had spinal injuries. And I'll tell you a funny little story. One particular driver, and he's still around today, I still have contact with him. Anyhow, I was fascinated. He told me in the course of working with him that he was illiterate. He didn't read or write.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, how did you get around? How did you find your way? And he said, well, my wife would map out the route that I was going, and I would match her writing to the signs. And he said, once I'd done the trip, he said I was right. But he said if I had to go somewhere new, she would map it out for me. So anyhow, I set about teaching him to read and write. And he lived down in Gippsland. And so there were a number of spinal injured people in his area. So he started a little newsletter. And it was excellent. It was really terrific. But there were often spelling mistakes. So I said to one day, oh, Viv, I said, there's a few spelling mistakes in that one. And he goes, well, you taught me. It must be your fault.
Yeah. There used to be a guy, a truckie, he wrote a book called Spelling for Those Who Can't Know How.
Yep.
Do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah. Do you remember that? Spelling for Those Who Can't Know How?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Written by a truck driver for illiterate truck drivers on how the words sound compared to how the words look.
That's
and
right.
You remember that? It was so good.
Yeah, exactly. I do remember that. I do. In fact, I think that must be a while ago, because I reckon that was around in Viv's day.
Yeah.
And so, so really when I looked back, that was my first introduction to the other side of the transport industry where drivers were permanently injured. And so we do talk to drivers, and of course the high incidence of PTSD in transport drivers is quite a worry, and it's often not recognised. And and it takes a huge toll on relationships as well.
Post-traumatic stress changes. Well, my personal experience is it changed me as a person. It changed me in a way that I came to value life very differently, and I came to value possessions as worth nothing. Money is pretty much worthless, and there's a lot of things that I don't find enjoyment in anymore because I find them frivolous and pointless and a waste, and it certainly put me on this track where I just want to see it different, because I've been lucky to not be killed, but when my mates get killed and then something cool does happen, and I think, oh, I'll ring Daniel. And I'm like, oh, fuck.
And Stephen, that's also grief. And grief for friends is very little recognised. What you just said in the early days when my son died. My son was buried the day before he turned 20, and he was electrocuted as a third-year apprentice. But, I'd be walking through the supermarket or the shopping centres, and Dean was a surfer. And so I'd see a cool T-shirt or board shorts or something, and I think, oh, he'd
Yep.
love those, and I'd go to buy them, and then it had hit me all over again that he wasn't there, and and in fact, I've just been talking with a fellow who lost a really good friend in the industry, and nobody's recognised his grief. We think grief is only for the immediate loved ones, and that's not the case. And Stephen, I remember you in your early days. In fact, I think that's how I can't remember how you and I connected, but somehow we
You were
did.
worried about me.
I sent you a message.
That's
I remember.
right.
I was worried about you, and
Yep.
uh,
I was worried about me.
I'm sure.
I've seen dead children. I've seen people with body parts missing, and it never affected me. Never. I never had a bad dream, never had a bad thought. But that day in 2012, when I was stuck on that scene for 7 hours, and I didn't get a break, I didn't get to be able to walk away and take 5 for myself. And then after it's all said and done, and they say, "Oh, you're right to go," and then you drive down the road, and that's when it hits you after when you're by yourself.
That's right.
And
that's right.
And by the
it's
time
it's the layers, Stephen. Like each time you've had an experience, it's layered and it sits in your. In fact, I like to say it's absorbed into your cells. And then one day your cells explode because they can't take any more, and that's when it hits you. And I suspect, I don't want to diagnose you in this podcast by any means, but I suspect for you that's what happened. One day you just went, I can't do this anymore.
Oh, it's not that I couldn't do it. It just doesn't make sense.
No, exactly.
If I know that one of my friends is going to get killed in a fight, you go along and you help out and try and help him out, and so that he doesn't get killed. And so it's the same thing with this work. If you see a dangerous practice at your work, if there's electrical cords on the ground, water on the ground, there's a slip or a trip or a fall from a height risk, you can mitigate those risks. But in the transport industry, you can't.
No.
You can't put a barrier up, you can't put a guard in place, you can't put a protocol in place, you can't put a safe work method statement or a job safety advice. You can only try and mitigate those risk factors.
Well, I'm hoping here in Victoria that with the fact that WorkSafe now, my argument was that truck fatalities weren't investigated as well as they could be. And so I'm hoping that WorkSafe Victoria will set the pace and start looking at truck fatalities and, in fact, injuries in a different way.
Well, I've noticed a significant drop in the number of fatalities since COVID-19. Obviously, there's less traffic on the road causing these accidents, but there's still drivers getting killed. Maybe not in Victoria. There was one in New South Wales there last Friday, 2 Fridays ago.
Yeah, there's been truck rollovers, but I don't think we've had fatalities so far. But we've had 17 work-related deaths already this year, and normally we get about 20 to 23 a year.
Yeah.
But already we've had 17.
Yeah. Terrible.
It's awful. It's awful. But we just got to keep plugging away at it, and we'll see how it pans out. We hope for change. That's all we can keep. And like I said, rattling cages, rattling doors, talking to people in power, and making them listen.
Yeah. Now, how can people follow the Victorian Truck Drivers Memorial? It has a Facebook, yeah?
We have a Facebook page, Victorian Truck Drivers Memorial. Is its Facebook page. People can contact me through the messenger on that. It has. You can send messages through that. It has its. You can send a message, and people do. And I'll usually answer them. I keep an eye on it, and I keep it very clean. There's no rubbish on it.
Yep.
And they can follow it there. And since we've incorporated, and that's only just really been finalised, so the memorial is now, it's independent of the truck show, the Alexandra Truck Rod Newt show. They have a representative on the committee, but it's independent, so, and it's got its own bank account. And
so the truck show is postponed as well.
Yeah, that's been postponed. I don't know when they're going to do that. So they can follow it there. But we are developing a website which we hope to have up soon, so people can follow. And when that's up, we will of course put it on the Facebook page with a link so people can follow it. And we hopefully we'll have an honour roll. Similar to that of the Transport Museum in Alice Springs, I noticed that they're setting up you can look up people on the Wall of Fame, the Hall of Fame. You can look at that, click on a letter and people will come up under that letter, and you can look for people on the Hall of Fame. We're hoping to do something very similar with photos, etc., on the website. So that's in process as we speak.
All right, excellent. All right, so we talked about the suicide walk, and we talked about the memorial, and we talked about your work, and we talked about your nomination. Is there anything else?
Look, I'm always available to talk with the driver who's struggling. I'm always happy to talk.
Yep.
Because, and of course, one of the difficulties for drivers is that they can't just drop off and visit a counsellor or a support worker, or, that they have very little free time for support. But with the beautiful power of Bluetooth, I'm able to talk to drivers while they're driving if they need. And as we know, drivers have a lot of time to think. Yeah. And often mountains are made out of molehills with too much time to think. And so I'm more than happy to take a call.
Awesome. Bette Phillips-Campbell, thank you very much.
Stephen, thank you ever so much, and good luck with what you're doing. I think the podcasts are an excellent idea, and I listen to them and I find them enormously interesting.
Thank you very much, Betty.
Thank you, Stephen.
We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.
There you have it, everyone.